Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our February Lunch and Learn. The Nature Conservancy always hosts a monthly lunch and learn, usually at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday or Thursday towards the end of the month. Today's topic is cover crop roots in winter. What are they doing in February? And so with us, we have two amazing farmers and agronomists, Matthew Burkholder, who is a farmer himself and also is a staff person with the Nature Conservancy, and Gary Pennel, who is an agronomist. So I'm going to turn it over to those two who are the experts, and we can get started.
Welcome, everyone. Like AJ said, my name is Matt Burkholder, and I work with the Nature Conservancy as a part of the Farmer Advocate Program. And today, for our Lunch and Learn, we're asking the question, what are cover crops doing in February? Oops. So just a little review, why did we plant cover crops in the fall? Well, here is a list of some of the benefits I have seen as a result of planting cover crops. First of all, I think it is our responsibility to reduce erosion. We know when you plant cover crops, when you get a good establishment, soil erosion can definitely be reduced. Another benefit I have seen is increased water infiltration. I will show you a picture later on in the presentation, a picture of a field, how water infiltration has definitely increased, and I've actually had some wet spots in the field disappear. We also know that weed suppression is definitely an issue sometimes, and cover crops are definitely helpful with that if we can get some good growth in the spring. Oftentimes on our farm, we are able to sometimes we're able to skip a pre-emerge herbicide application because of the cover crop residue that we have. It's also been said that there's equal to 2 African elephants per acre of soil life under the soil, and we need to feed that. And cover crops are definitely a good way to help feed the soil life. Cover crops also loosen the subsoil and the topsoil. I know I've noticed on our farm, we are using less down pressure on our planters to get the planter in the ground. So that has definitely been a benefit. Also, cover crops are good at sequestering nutrients from the previous crop. Instead of, if there's any leftover nitrogen from a corn crop, if we can get a cover crop out there after the corn, we know that the cover crop will hold on to that nutrients and help prevent it from leaching down into the groundwater. And last but certainly not least, I know I've experienced on our farm, as a result of cover crop and other best management practices, we are building organic matter. So that's just some of the reasons why we are planting cover crops on our farm. Here is a picture to the right. You can see 2 different pieces of soil. This is a picture that I took last November. This was a peer group meeting that the farmer advocates host. And as you can see, the soil on the right is a healing soil. The soil on the right has not been tilled in 8 years, and you can see some nice cover crop growth there. And the soil on the left, you can see that pretty much looks like a brick. And just about a month before I took that picture, that field was chisel plowed. It had a field cultivator pass, and then they went through with anhydrous toolbar and put anhydrous on. So the field on the left was just plowed a month prior to the picture. The field on the right has not been plowed in 8 years. So just a good little visual there that we noticed on our farmer peer group meetings. Here is a picture of cereal rye roots in October. I surface seeded some cover crops with a drone back in mid-September. If you remember last fall, it was very dry, so the seed sat there for a little while, but we did get some growth there in the fall. And like I said, a little photosynthesis is better than none, better than definitely a bare field. So here is a picture of some cereal rye roots. I just took this picture last week. This cereal rye was also surface seeded with a high boy seeder into corn in mid-September, around September 15th. And the seed sat there for a few weeks because it was pretty dry, but as you can see, the roots are really starting to take off. And like I said, this picture was just last week, so this is pretty recent picture. Here is the picture that I talked about earlier in the presentation, where I was talking about how water infiltration can be increased as a result of cover crops and other best management practices. This field has no drainage tile. I started regenerative practices on this farm back in 2012. And where the two yellow flags are, there used to be wet spots there. And when we would do tillage or when we would plant, we would always have to drive around these areas. There would be circles out there. We'd drive around the areas, work around them, plant around them, and then maybe come back in a week later and plant those wet spots. And then it would inevitably, we would get a heavy rain, and half the time those wet spots would flood out again. But now, as a result of using biology instead of steel and our other best management practices, as you can see, when I planted my winter wheat there, that was about a year ago, I was able to plant right through, and those wet spots are gone. And that has been 13 years since this farm has seen a plow. Oops, wrong. Here is a picture of some soil life, and I'm going to let Gary take it from here and share some of his thoughts.
Okay, so introduction wise, I'm actually, my name is Gary Pennel. I'm an agronomist with the Farmers Elevator of New Bavaria, Ohio. It's a co-op that's owned by the farmers. So I was kind of thinking we actually are farmers in a group trying to do the things that is being promoted here today. And this particular picture actually is of a compost material that one of the growers that I have, a farmer, actually produced this compost through a process himself. And but I really wanted the picture to come up because when we see the activity there with like the earthworm becomes the first thing, but I know when I zoomed into this picture and we kind of tried to look deeper, there's so much more there from a biology standpoint that maybe we don't see just looking at the picture to start with. And I know, for instance, this has like 16 to 1800 species of bacteria that's in this compost once they analyze it, and 300 or 400 different species of fungi, along with like the earthworms and everything that's in between. I think it's important that we realize as we talk about cover crops, we're looking at a system that integrates the growing, living cover crop and kind of how we're looking, but we need to then consider, okay, how does this tie into the biology that's part of it, the chemistry in the soils, the readings, all those things that go hand in hand, okay? And we need to get a system so that we're looking at all that. So I know when I show this picture to some people and they kind of draw their head back, they're like, they're scared of it. But our soil needs to be a living system like this. So I don't know, what was your take on this picture, Matt, when you first kind of viewed it? I mean,
When I first saw this picture, I thought, man, I would love to be able to spread this very lightly over some of my fields. There's a lot of life here and a lot going on.
yeah. I know when Matt asked me to kind of help with this, and I thought I'm not an expert on cover crops. I mean, I farm myself, clear from like grew up farming, okay, with my dad and those things, but I've had cover crops since in the 80s, and it was more challenging then. But learning what we're learning now is exciting. And as I looked at Matt's pictures, and I kind of think back through the rest of his PowerPoint that really hit me, like the very first picture had the snow, kind of as the example of things of, those things. And I wrote down the word that we're talking snow cover. So we're not only talking, about the cover crop, the green part of it. I think there's something unique here that ties in that we have a snow cover and we're holding it in place. It's not all leaving the ground. It gets a chance to kind of soak in. And it made me think back, I had seeded cover crops in the 80s and that, and it was days that it would be snowing, late season cereal rye. And we think, oh, it's not even going to grow. And, it's snowing. And then we get a cover of snow on there. And the rye would suddenly just kind of appear, and in the spring, we had a really actively growing crop, moving that forward. So I think, we get the vegetative part, but we also get so many other features of some of these cover crops that we sometimes don't see. So, I actually had some comment. If you want to move to your next slide, Matt, and you know, the things that hit me about like building organic, actually the one that had several, the list of things. If you could go back one more. So there should be one in between. There we go. And I think what I was trying to use Matt's pictures here because I'm a picture learner. I like that dramatic difference between those two soils that we can see that are really the same, but they've been treated differently, doing the right things, doing what we thought was the right things, and now we're learning are the wrong. But what hit me, like building organic matter, that bottom topic that we talk about there, as I learn on these things, I think it's so important that we realize it's not just a reading of 4% organic matter, that we need to understand how much active carbon is in some of these things, like they will talk on a Haney soil test about water extractable organic carbon. And it sounds like, a whole big mouth, but it's really what portion of that organic matter is the active part that's feeding the biology, that's doing that sequestering nutrients and those things. And I think that's what we need to gain, tremendously, having an understanding of it. And it made me think of an example. I have a Haney test that someone had me looking at, and it had high organic matter, it had high water extractable organic carbon, but it lacked the biology. So even though we had put in place one thing, until we bring those pieces together, I think it's important that we realize it takes everything kind of working in unison to make the cycle, function properly. And then as it starts growing, it becomes a bigger entity of soil health, kind of like what we seen when I showed that example of the compost. That's an accelerated system drawn into one place. I'd like to be able to scoop up soils and have that everywhere. So I don't know. I guess the other thing that really pops in. Go ahead.
I should be more clear with these two pictures. These two fields are separated by a grass lane, so they're like 40 feet away. This isn't, 3 miles away. This is literally 40 feet away. So just so we're clear on the difference in soil picture.
Yeah. To me, that's amazing. And I see it on field after field. I mean, we've actually went backwards on a lot of these soils from what they originally were when they were in rotations and had the covers, had the biology. We have to find ways to get back to what those were and initiating things. So one of the things that really stood out, and it's evident in both of your next slides, Matt, to me, is as we look at cover crops, is like here, we see the residue. It was planted in that soybean stubble, and we've got residue all around that root. And what I realize as an agronomist, we have to find ways to get these plants, the cover crop, functioning with us, and the biology, and digesting the residue, okay, turning it into the carbon. So it's that carbon as a food source, getting the system functioning. And the next slide even shows it more. I mean, we see it at a different time of the year, with beside the shovel there. I mean, we have all that residue off to the right of the shovel. What I'm really seeing over time, a lot of these fields do not function properly to have that residue disappearing like it needs to. Makes me think I have a farmer, actually the guy who made the compost, and he talks about having a rye cover crop, and his biology will eat up that rye during a soybean growing season, okay, and he doesn't have no problem harvesting in the fall, and he's got neighbors who maybe have cereal rye, and all of a sudden the rye causes plugging problems with the combine because we don't have the full system operating to help us with the cover crop, supplying the nutrients, supplying all those things. So I don't know. I think that's an important part, which from my standpoint brings me to looking at the last picture where we talked your conservation agriculture. You know, that the horse is pulling the planter, and the first thing I think of that's great to see that, you know, that much cover crop, that much biomass. But my mind says, what do we do next? You know, we have all that residue. How do we get the biology? How do we get everything working so that that corn crop is not competing against the biomass, but using it? And those are questions, you know, as agronomists, as leaders in all this, we have to keep answering. The other thing this picture really made me think back, my father had started farming with horses, and he had 2 horses on a 2-row planter. It wasn't quite this big, but he was completely clean till. He'd plowed it. He'd worked it 4 times. You know, he's out there with the horses. And this is a great picture. But when he was farming, he had a rotation that had clover, that had hay, that had buckwheat, all the things we're using for cover. He was raising those as crops. So it kind of we're cycling back to a different way. So I'll turn it back to you, Matt. Maybe you've got some other things to add at this point, or we can, you know, do some conversation of what we're talking about.
Yeah, we can definitely open it up for some conversation. If participants want to ask any questions or comment on any pictures, I can scroll through some pictures. So.
Gary, I've got one quick question, and this is just me not knowing a lot about history. But you mentioned that the cover crops grown today were just crops that were, I guess, going to market before, like the
Yes,
buckwheat and things like that.
right.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just wondering, like, if there is a way for those same cover crops to still be marketable today, or do they not see a long enough growing season to actually like have enough biomass to go to market?
So several of those do, like it popped in my mind. My dad would raise buckwheat. He would actually raise 2 crops in a year's time. They're very short season. He harvested it and sold that, and they were competing against a lot of weed pressure, sandy soil. So he'd plant it late in warm soils, get it to really come up, and he would harvest, you know, very quickly on it. And maybe the second one only was just to have a cover there, something to plow down. And the same way the clovers. I mean, he would raise it for a hay crop. He talked about harvesting the seed, that they would cut it and actually harvest the seed and use that to interseed into the wheat crop another time. So, I mean, these practices are not new. It's just, and then how do we adapt them to have a marketable product? And, you know, making money as we make these changes. You have to have economic stability from it, and they're great environmental practices. Is
In regards to management practices, for example, with this picture, like Gary mentioned, there's a lot of residue there. Let's backtrack to spring. I planted corn into a mixture of annual ryegrass and cereal ryegrass, and that was about knee high when I planted the corn into that mixture green. I would have had some legumes in there too, but a few things happened and we didn't get the legumes in. But so I planted the corn in green into that cover crop mix, and the corn grew, and by harvest, you know, the corn yield was 195 bushel corn. Plus that cover crop residue, you know, there's a little bit still left under there from the previous year. And then now I've got 85 pounds of CRI out there. So my plan this spring, when I'll plan to plant soybeans green, I'm going to plant an earlier season soybean. I'm going to plant like a 2.8 maturity bean in there to be able to harvest them a little earlier in the fall. So if there is some residue left, you know, that, and if we would have a wet fall, then we wouldn't have, you know, problems with the combine. And also, when we terminate the rye, I'm going to try some roller crimping this spring, but when we terminate the rye, I always add a gallon of molasses to feed the soil biology and help with some residue breakdown. We do that with the first herbicide pass, and then I do that with my second herbicide pass and nutrient application on the soybeans. I do a foliar nutrient application. And then on the second nutrient application on the soybeans, we'll add another gallon of molasses. So I'm putting 3 gallons of molasses a year on this field, on the residue on the soybeans. So just as a precaution, because of all the residue we do have out here, I'm gonna plant a little earlier season soybean. So, you know, so we don't have any challenges, hopefully in the fall because of the residue.
One of the things that pops into my mind, Matt, as we look at this picture that's up and showing that root mass, you know, of the cereal rye at this time of year. And as I work with biology, trying to understand better, you know, how we can cycle nutrients, do all those things, I look at that root system there and realize if we tie in biology, and that would be the bacteria, you know, are quite a bit smaller, but the fungi part of things, all of a sudden that root system that we see there becomes much more intense with the biology with it. Because I've seen situations where we get a root mass like on wheat or something, and then have biology with it, and it'll reach across the field. I mean, we've tried to do tests, and you have maybe a 60-foot strip, you know, you're trying to do side by side comparisons, for example, and you'll see the biology has moved across from a treated area, that a root like this, into the other areas that were not treated and stuff. So if we think about having a living plant here and the cover crop and then enhance the biology, we have a whole nother system working for us that expands, that, you know, all of a sudden you got a whole nother root system that we're not seeing maybe in this picture. And I think that's important, understanding what the biology part of it brings to us.
And Gary, I love that you mentioned the biology, because I'm into this system, into it a few years here now. My soybean seed will not have seed treatment on. It will have living microbes, and it will have inoculant on. I won't have any fungicide or insecticide on. And then I'm hoping, because of all the corn residue here and the cereal rye residue, that I will not need a pre-emerge herbicide also. So the farther I'm getting into this system, I'm able to take some of those things away and stimulate some of the biology. I don't have the records in front of me right now, but last spring I took a Haney soil health test on this field, and I remember the information was pretty nice to have. I kind of got a baseline started for the biology, so it's going to be nice to contract, kind of have a baseline and kind of, you know, keep track of that as the years go by.
One of the things that I think, somebody else have a question?
No worry, Gary. I'll just try to ask Matt, actually. Matt, you mentioned one of the site, you know, with or without a cover crop, help with the drainage, you know, basically remove all those kind of the wet spot. It's just topography wise, are these a relatively flat field, or kind of do they have like a really low spot?
They're pretty flat. This is kind of a
Okay.
area right here. If you look to the left of the picture, it goes up a little bit. There's a little bit of little bit of a higher spot there, but yeah, I'm in pretty flat Allen County, Ohio, so.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. You know, those kind of definitely help with filtration and then infiltration, things like that. Because my focus is not on the infield cover crop, but actually a couple of years ago when I was doing the research, just drive around in Northwest Ohio during the winter, one time early spring, I literally take one field across the road. On the left, there's no cover crop. On the other side, there's a cover crop. After rainfall, the cover crop side, there's basically no ponding water. On the other side, there's a lot of ponding water and soil erosion. I can see. So that's literally you can see. No need much of data really to actually prove that part. Yeah, that's more than a comment instead of. And then Gary, you mentioned the biology. So I just want to clarify. You want to see the biology, basically all the activity related to biology just beneath the soil. During the February or springtime. In the winter, it's active. Is that right?
So that biology actually is active, like under that snow cover, certain species of it, and the environment that they create, is tremendous. Those earthworms that have come up, those are tunnels that's going to help it drain. Looking at this infiltration and all that combination, and what I like, the cover crop, if we have the biology, when we go into the next crop, so we're planning. It doesn't matter what is next year. We've started a cycle where you don't have to start fresh with everything having to take off from a like pulling out of the starting line. Okay. We have a lot of things already happening, and then we're putting a crop into an environment that it's already accelerating. And so it's an excellent opportunity to use this continual life process to help us on the next crop.
So, for example, the picture we're looking at here, this field was wheat last year, and we did not bale the straw. And then I let the volunteer wheat and the weeds grow for a month or so, and then at August 1st, we came in with I think it was like a 10 different species cover crop mix into this field. So that's currently what is in this field right now. 3/4 of that mix was a warm season mixture, and then I've got some cereal rye and crimson clover out there also that will come out of dormancy in the spring. So we're continually trying to work on infiltration on this field. So that just a little idea, that's what's out there now. I'm not going to put any granular fertilizer on that field, and we are going to plant soybeans in the spring.
I guess I know we're about out of time. One thing that really triggers with me is that having these short, where we're doing this presentation type thing and getting thinking what needs to be next for topics or where we go with things, because we're in such an early stage on understanding certain parts of this, of how the interaction between the biology and how it, and bringing it then to the farmer, the leaders and these other ones, so that we can move the system forward and understand how we take a particular field, look at the negatives that it has and the positives, and develop, how can we best fix this particular field the quickest or in the long-term pattern. So